Backyard Devotional.
So the other day I'm reading the creation account in the book of Genesis and how God, after creating the heavens and the earth, looks at all he created and calls it very good. And yet, even though he calls it all very good, he takes a portion of his creation and he recreates it. He turns it into something better. Now, we're not sure exactly how he did it, but I get this picture of God planting flowers and planting trees and rerouting rivers and streams and moving mountains and hills. And he turns this piece of real estate into a garden. He turns space into place. In our contemporary language, we might equate this to turning a house into a home. And what does he do? He places our first parents in the middle of that home. So he turns to Adam and Eve and he says two things to them. First, he says, go there, go, like be fruitful and multiply and tend the garden and cultivate the land and fill the earth and enjoy me and enjoy each other and enjoy everything that I have created. But then God says something else. He says, don't go there. Don't eat from that tree. Don't eat from that fruit. And in our minds, this might seem like a small thing, but for God, that obedience, that need for obedience was absolutely huge. So our first parents, what do? They rebel. And instead of obeying God, they listen to the words of the serpent. And it's interesting that God, here he is, he's walking through the garden in the cool of the day, and he asks a question of Adam and Eve, and he doesn't ask, what did you do, even though that would have been a perfectly legitimate question to ask. Rather, the first question God asks is, where are you? Like even before Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden, that sense of place is already disappearing from their hearts. And yet, even though that sense of place had been lost and had disappeared, that desire for place continues to remain and continues to remain even in our day and age. It's part of our humanity. It's part of our DNA. It's our longing for home. And we see this even in our cultural artifacts, in the stories and in our movies and in the desire to find home and to return home because, there's no place like home. And yet all these cultural attempts fail because, as noted in the letter to the Hebrews, we ultimately seek not Kansas or the Shire or District 12. Ultimately, what we seek is the New Jerusalem, the new heavens and the new earth. What we ultimately seek is what we read of in Hebrews 11, a city with foundations, a city whose architect and builder is God himself. And by God's grace, we get a taste of that city every time we read the pages of Scripture. I mean, it's tempting to think of the Bible as simply a book of morals and a book of rules, but the Bible is much more than that. The Bible is more like finding a box, and you open the box, and inside the box are all sorts of things, letters and postcards and poetry and songs that tell the story of people who lived long ago. And yet, even though they lived long ago, by the saving work of Christ, we're grafted into that story. We become part of that story. That story, in a sense, becomes our story. And that's why we should read Scripture not as a wooden duty, but instead with a sense of imagination, as a story that reads more like a family journal, a story that tells us where we came from, but also tells us where we're going. It's a story that moves from a garden to a wilderness, from a tabernacle to a temple, from exile to a manger, from a cross to an open tomb, and from the day of Pentecost to home. Amen.